In this video, I'll wrap up our discussion of social psychology by talking about social influence, which encompasses several related phenomena such as social facilitation, social loafing, conformity, compliance, and obedience. Social influence is defined as the process by which people change their behavior as a result of the presence of others. Typically, the focus in social influence is on changes in people's actual outward behavior. This is distinguished from persuasion, where the focus is more on changing a person's cognitive attitudes or beliefs. Of course, these two can certainly be related in that changing someone's attitude may very well end up changing their behavior too. For example, changing someone's attitude about a particular political candidate might make it more likely that the person will then go out and vote for that candidate. However, it's also worth noting that attitudes and behavior are surprisingly not as strongly correlated as you might think. Although we often like to think of ourselves as rational creatures who always behave in accordance with our core values and beliefs, research shows that often this isn't the case. A lot goes into influencing what we actually do in any given situation, and our attitudes are only one piece of the puzzle. The first social psychological experiment ever conducted was done by Norman Triplett in 1898. Triplett watched bicyclists who competed in two different types of races. In one race, the cyclists competed in individual time trials. That is, each cyclist raced a particular route on his own, and at the end, all of the competitors' different times were compared. In a second type of race, the cyclists directly competed against each other on a race course at the same time. Triplett noticed that the cyclists tended to record faster times, on average, when they were directly competing versus racing independently. To study this in more depth, Triplett devised the following experiment. Participants came into the lab and completed a very simple task. They just wound a spool as fast as they could. Triplett randomly assigned some participants to complete the task by themselves and other participants to complete it at the same time as others. He found that, indeed, participants were faster to wind the spool when others were present versus when they were alone. The resulting phenomenon is called social facilitation, where people perform better on tasks when they are with others compared to when they are by themselves. Maybe you've experienced this yourself if you notice that you perform better during a performance or athletic competition when you're in front of a crowd versus just practicing on your own. Why does social facilitation occur? It's thought that the presence of other people increases our physiological arousal. For easy tasks, this increased arousal is helpful for our performance. It amps us up and helps us execute better than we normally would have otherwise. For difficult tasks, though, too much arousal can be harmful and can actually cause us to choke. Therefore, social facilitation occurs best for simple or well-learned tasks. Of course, as anyone who has ever completed a group project knows, people don't always work harder when they're with others. Instead, they might sometimes slack off in a phenomenon called social loafing. Social loafing occurs when people put in less effort when they are working with a group compared to working individually. It's been observed not just on group projects in school, but for many other kinds of tasks as well. For example, in one study, participants were simply asked to yell as loud as they could, either by themselves or in a group. Unbeknownst to the participants, the researchers had cleverly devised a way to measure each person's individual decibel output. Consistent with the social loafing phenomenon, people yelled louder when it was just them versus when they were in a group. So why does the presence of others sometimes cause us to work harder and sometimes to slack off? It mainly comes down to whether the output is group-based or individual. With individual outputs, such as individual race times, the presence of others can increase our performance, especially for simple or well-learned tasks. In contrast, when the output is group-based, that is, everybody's contributions are averaged together, people tend to socially loaf. One way to combat social loafing, then, is to make each person accountable for his or her individual efforts. If each person's outputs are known and directly observable, people are far less likely to slack off on a group task. The presence of other people can also influence our behavior through our inherent desire to belong and fit in. Conformity is the act of changing one's actions to align with the group's norms. Perhaps the most famous study on social conformity was conducted by Solomon Asch in 1951. Asch had participants come into the lab for what seemed like a simple task, judging the length of different lines. Specifically, participants had to decide which of three comparison lines were the same length as a target line, as you can see in the example on this slide. The task was designed to be pretty easy. In this example, my guess is you probably had no trouble discerning that B is the correct answer. In Asch's study, participants were seated around a table with 6 other supposed participants. There were 18 total trials, and for each trial, each person went around the table and said his answer out loud. The twist in the study was that, in reality, there was only one true participant. The rest were Confederates, who were working for the experimenter. Moreover, on 12 of the trials, the Confederates were instructed to all say the same wrong answer. For instance, each of the Confederates might say that A is the correct answer in the example picture on this slide, when it clearly is not. Ash had set up the experiment so that the participant was always assigned to go next to last. If 5 other people before you all said that A was the correct answer here, what do you think you would do? Ash found that on the critical trials, 35% of participants' responses corresponded to the Confederates' incorrect answer. Moreover, roughly 75% of participants caved to the pressure of conformity and gave an incorrect answer on at least one trial during the experiment. After the study was over, Ash interviewed the participants and found that there were a couple different reasons why they might choose to conform. First, some participants knew that the Confederates were incorrect, but outwardly conformed simply to avoid public embarrassment. This is called normative influence, when we change our behavior out of a desire to fit in or avoid disapproval from others. Other participants genuinely began to question their own judgment. After all, if every other person is saying the same answer, is it possible that you might be missing something? Some participants certainly thought so. For example, here is a picture from the actual study. The naive participant is seated in the middle of this picture. You can see him leaning over the table, clearly beginning to question his own perception. This is called informational influence, when we use group information to guide our own decision-making, trusting that the majority must somehow be correct. For a funny video showing the power of conformity, you can check out the Brain Games supplemental video on Canvas. So far, we've covered examples of how people can somewhat unintentionally influence our behavior. For example, when other people are doing a group project with us, they're not trying to get us to work less hard. In fact, they may be trying to do just the opposite. However, what about when people are directly trying to influence our behavior? For example, if a salesperson is trying to convince you to buy a particular product, or if a political candidate is trying to convince you to vote for him or her. This is where the study of compliance comes in. Compliance is the act of agreeing to an explicit request. If you agree to help out your friend when they ask you for a favor, you've complied with their request. Compliance is of obvious interest to any kind of job that involves sales. A researcher named Robert Cialdini, who I mentioned in the first video, studies social influence. And he actually spent a year secretly observing people in these kinds of positions, such as car salesmen, telemarketers, and waitstaff at upscale restaurants. Cialdini found that across these different jobs, there were certain general principles that made people more likely to comply with a request, typically to buy something. For example, humans have a strong norm of reciprocity. That is, if we receive a free gift, we innately feel obligated to return in kind. This is one reason why organizations might send you free things in the mail, along with an opportunity to purchase their product. They're hoping that by giving you something small, you'll feel indebted to comply with their request for your money. If you're interested in learning more about Cialdini's work, you can check out his book, which is aptly titled Social Influence. Finally, obedience is similar to compliance, but takes things up a notch. Specifically, obedience is a special form of compliance that involves obeying a command from an authority figure. For example, if a policeman instructs you to pull over and you do so, you are obeying this directive from someone in a position of authority. Authority figures include not only policemen and governmental agents, but also people whom we hold in high respect, such as teachers or scientific experts. For example, in Milgram's shock studies that we discussed in the first video, the authority figure was an experimenter associated with Yale University, a very prestigious school. As Milgram found, authority figures are powerful influences on our behavior. You might wonder, though, if Milgram's findings would still occur today. The original studies were conducted in the early 1960s, after all. In 2009, a researcher named Jerry Berger attempted to answer this question by conducting a partial replication of Milgram's studies. Berger conducted a study very similar to Milgram's, but he made several key changes to make sure that the study adhered to current ethical standards. Berger's findings largely mirrored Milgram's original results. That is, Berger found that people in his partial replication obeyed at similarly high rates compared to Milgram's original studies. However, it's also worth noting that some people have called into question Milgram's interpretations of his original data. In particular, a psychologist named Gina Perry spent several months reviewing original transcripts from Milgram's experiments and interviewing people who were participants in his studies. What she found caused her to question whether Milgram's findings really tell us much about obedience. For example, Perry found that a significant number of participants were suspicious about Milgram's experimental setup. That is, they doubted whether the Confederate was really being shocked. And of course, we know he wasn't. And these skeptical participants were also the ones who were most likely to obey. That is, if people really thought that they were potentially harming another human being, they were actually less likely to obey the experimenter's commands. If you're interested in learning more about Perry's research and what she uncovered, you can check out her book called Behind the Shock Machine. Additionally, for a nice video that summarizes a lot of the social influence research that we just discussed, you can check out the Crash Course supplemental video on Canvas. In this video, we covered topics related to social influence, including social loafing, social facilitation, conformity, compliance, and obedience. For the exam, you'll need to be able to define and distinguish between each of these terms and identify them in an example. You should also be able to describe the results from some of the key studies we talked about, such as the Asch conformity studies and the Milgram shock studies.